and welcome to Conservation Matters, a show by the Midland Conservation District. My name is Benjamin Van Dyke. Thank you for joining us. I'm a technical assistant with the Midland Conservation Districts. For those that don't know, Midland Conservation District is one of Michigan's 75 conservation districts. Districts are local units of government that help local landowners with conservation issues such as soil erosion, habitat for wildlife, and invasive species. Our last show talked a lot about invasive species and how we partner with our local SISMA, the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, on combating invasive species, how to identify invasive species, and how to get involved with this issue. Today, I'm pleased to be joined again by the SISMA coordinator, Matthew Lindauer. He's going to be telling us a little bit about their latest project, an invasive species survey that they did on our local Tittabawassee River. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us.
Thanks.
And we appreciate your time. Can you just tell us a little bit more for those that missed the last episode on what you do at the SISMA and why invasive species are such an important issue?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me back. SISMA, as you said, is Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So there's several throughout the state, but I look after the counties of Gladwin, Gratiot, Isabella, Clare, and Midland. So this survey that we'll be discussing started up in Sanford and went all the way down. We actually ended up going into Saginaw, which is technically outside of the boundaries we look after, but you know, that's how rivers work. They go where they want. So the purpose that we serve is to look after invasive species and how they're spreading and what they're doing and where they are, how we can slow the spread or get rid of these plants. So we are an organization that people can and should reach out to when they have concerns regarding invasive species. So part of that, what we're looking to do, took place along a 42-mile stretch of the Tittabawassee River. So that's what we'll be really digging into today. But for those that might not know, an invasive species in this context, the definition that we're using is a non-native species that has the potential to cause harm or damage an area or ecosystem. So in this instance, again, it has to specifically cause harm and be non-native. So that's what we were looking at during this survey.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the initial idea behind the survey was when the failure of the dam occurred.
Yes.
Invasive species by nature are so easily spread. You guys wisely thought that it would be a smart idea to see just what the impacts and the effects of that dam failure were on the Tittabawassee as a watershed.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone that has been in the area and has seen the damage caused by those very unfortunate dam failures knows just how much of a change to the ecosystem and the landscape and waterscape that caused. I mean, Sanford Lake is a river now that runs through the center of where the lake used to be. So we're talking about a massive change to the ecosystem, and with those changes, it causes potential for more spreading and more entrenching of these invasive species.
Sure.
It essentially opened up real estate for these plants to really dig in to
Sure.
places they might not have been able to before. So that's what we wanted to take a look at. It is the first comprehensive survey of this stretch of the Tittabawassee that I'm aware of. So there wasn't a ton of data to compare it to, but there was data from the MISN mapping that people do through the MISN app.
Sure.
That we could take a look at and kind of compare.
Sure.
So that was the best that we had going into this. So moving forward now, because of the survey that we've done, there's data to look back on and compare to moving forward. So,
well, that's exciting. We're excited to see what you found. Thank you so much for being here today. And yeah, the results, I'm sure, were quite interesting after such a long stretch of river to survey. You said how many miles?
42, just a little over 42. So the map of it will show all the points of where things were mapped. If it's up on the screen now, you can have a look at it. And you can see there's a stretch of about, an eighth of a bunch of markers, and then there's
Sure.
a stretch where there's nothing at all.
Sure.
And that's not because there wasn't invasive species in there, but again, because of the change to the river.
Sure.
We were not able to access those points.
Sure.
There was no place to get in and out. So we technically could not get in there and map what was there. So that's why there's that break, not because there's
Okay.
some area completely pristine of invasive species,
Sure.
unfortunately. So yeah, we wanted to take a look at what we might find in there, see if there was anything new to the area. We had 2 surveyors that were with us for the summer, and they were just in kayaks. They used an app called Survey 123 to take
Okay.
pictures and map those points on there. And anything they could see from their kayaks with the naked eye, they counted as a sighting or spotting of an invasive species. So that's how we decided what to collect.
Sure.
They were educated on a list of things to expect to see, and then occasionally they'd run into something that we weren't expecting, and we'd verify that and mark it moving forward. So that's kind of our methods of collection. The water was pretty murky, so we did have them use a kind of pond rake to get in and drag it on the depths
Sure.
periodically and see if they pulled up anything there.
Okay.
So they weren't perfect conditions for surveying, but they absolutely did the best they could and got a lot of good data for us to work off of.
And now, was the focal point of the survey primarily invasive plants?
Yes, it was invasive plants. We did have some non-plant species to be aware of. There's the rusty crayfish and red swamp crayfish
Okay.
that are issues in other areas. They did not see any out there on the river. We weren't really
Excellent.
expecting to see them, but you know, it's a body of water and they very well could be in there. So
Sure.
that was one of the things we made sure that they were aware of when they were out there looking, but no big exciting animal species that we found out there. It's all plants. So I guess we can get right into talking about some of the stuff that they saw out there. One of the biggest ones that they saw in terms of numbers was autumn olive, which was no surprise whatsoever. It's a woody shrub, like a small tree essentially, and they found a ton of that all on the banks of the river, all on the edges there, and that's a pretty easy one to spot. It's kind of got silver on the underside of the leaves, so when the wind hits it, you'll see some green and then kind of a not full on shiny, but a bit of a silverish shimmer underneath, so they could spot that. And they were going through the river at different times, different seasons, while different things were in bloom, so at certain times some things were easier to spot than others, but at the very beginning the autumn olive was in full bloom, so they saw a lot of that. We saw a good amount of buckthorn out there as well. There's 2 species, although it seems that the one they saw most often was common buckthorn.
Sure.
It has a lot of similar properties to the autumn olive plant, but that was one that, again, once you have seen it a handful of times and know what you're looking for, it's got relatively distinct leaves and patterns on them. It'll eventually grow berries, and I think that composed about 25% of the overall sightings. So
For all invasive species?
on the river, yeah, that we
Wow.
found, yeah, the buckthorn and the buckthorn and autumn olive were the majority.
Sure.
So, and then again, there's the other glossy buckthorn. They only found one instance of glossy buckthorn as opposed to the common buckthorn, which there was a
Okay.
lot of. I couldn't tell you exactly why that is, because they like similar areas, but it just apparently it's not as pervasive in those areas as maybe the common is. So
Sure.
a bit of a mixed bag, but I guess it's better to not see it than to see it. So
Absolutely. I'm sure autumn olive and buckthorn being the dominant species along the river, being these shrubby, woody plants, there's a lot of potential to impact the river negatively in that way.
yeah, and you know, there is and there isn't, because part of it being there on the banks, they have these deep, strong root systems, and that's technically helpful with erosion.
Sure.
But there are native plants that can serve that same purpose
Sure.
that don't have the negative impacts. So they're serving somewhat of a service, but that makes it even trickier when you let something spread and take root like that.
Absolutely.
Then you're going to remove something and have to replace it pretty quickly to
Sure.
serve that same function. So
Absolutely.
I hate to say it, it's serving a little bit of a function, but again,
Right.
I'd rather not see it. I'd rather see something native there
Right.
growing.
Something that can serve that same function and support the biodiversity of the area.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. Japanese knotweed was one we thought we might see. They didn't end up seeing any out there, but it's a problem here in the States. It kind of grows and looks a bit like bamboo.
Sure.
It's pretty distinct. but they didn't see any along the river side. But it is blooming, just finishing up its blooming season right now in October. So it's easiest to spot about a month and a half after we finish the survey. So could be different if they were to go back and do that survey for a number of more months. Barberry is another one we'll talk about just a little bit. They didn't see it out there. It's a smaller plant. I mean, it can get pretty big. It's, can get to be a pretty decent sized bush, but they didn't see any out there either. But that's another ornamental plant that we see a lot of the woods and even in some people's gardens, unfortunately. But
I've heard that one attracts ticks.
Yeah, it does. And there's some discussion as to why that is. And I don't think there's a definitive answer just yet, but some people think because it is so thorny, it has very almost like hypodermic needles on this thing. Very small, thin, sharp thorns. They think, people don't fuss with it too much. It makes for a relatively safe nesting place for the ticks until they're ready to latch on to
Hitch a ride, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So purple loosestrife was another one, and we saw this in the area that we talked about that used to be Sanford Lake, that's now just a river with kind of this strange, mucky soil.
Yeah, a creek, really.
Yeah, all along what used to be the lake is now covered in purple loosestrife and some native trees, which makes the approach to treatment trickier because there's native mixed in there, but a ton of purple loosestrife all throughout there. And one of the issues that we have with purple loosestrife is it takes over, and the natural species of plants, there's little breaks in where they're growing, and the ducks in particular can use this for nesting. But when the purple loosestrife grows in, it's very dense, it creates a monoculture, and there's no place for the ducks to land and make their nests. So they just say, we're going to keep on flying until we find some spot to land. Then you see a dip in the waterfowl population because there's a spike in the purple loosestrife population. So this was one of the ones that I feel relatively comfortable saying that we saw a big shift in the amount of it as a direct result from the dam failures and the lakes emptying out. So that was really something to see, especially when that was in bloom. They were growing above my head in some areas. I didn't know they could grow that large, but whether it be the composition in that lake bed soil and between that and a seed bank that must be in there, they really took to it. They're growing pretty rapidly in there. So.
I know purple loosestrife, each plant has a ton of seeds per plant.
Yeah.
So I'm sure all it took for that flood to just wash that seed bank, literally deposit it all along the river, like you're saying, was really all it took.
Yeah, and all the nutrients there in that soil, they're loving it. So there's a lot of it, but there's things that you can do when it's there. In fact, I'll touch on it briefly because it's pretty interesting with the purple loosestrife. There's a beetle, and we call that a biocontrol, something that'll go in and take care of this invasive species. And we don't do it often because of the risk of, in this case, the insect deciding it's had enough purple loosestrife or it's eaten all of it and wants to move on to something else.
Introducing another invasive.
Yeah, so this is a unique instance where that's actually shown to be pretty promising so far of a biocontrol, a specific beetle that just feeds on the purple loosestrife. So one of those interesting options for control that you don't get to hear a lot. So it's fun to talk.
And I'm sure more cost effective too.
Yeah.
Obviously more environmentally friendly than pesticides.
Yeah, definitely. So it's fun to talk about. I'll do it whenever I get the chance. So here we are. Pondweed is one of the aquatic ones that's purely in the water. It's, you don't have to look on the banks or anything for that. And it has kind of lasagna ribbon-like noodles along the edges, the way they kind of wave up and down. And there's nothing else in there that has those quite so distinctly. And curly pondweed, as well as a lot of the other aquatic weeds that they found, the issue that they pose is that they'll grow up from the bottom of the lake where they're rooted, or river in this case, and they'll form large mats on the top of the river. And then next thing you know, you're getting props clogged up on boat engines, or sucking it in through an intake on a jet ski or something, what have you. Not to mention, fishing becomes a lot more difficult when you can't see and there's a big layer of plants on the top. And fortunately, they didn't see any great big mats of it. There were some that were reaching the surface and forming small clumps, but I mean, it can really you know, it can almost look like a grassy field is more than a river.
Wow.
If it goes on, if it is allowed to spread enough. So that was one they saw a decent amount of there as far as purely aquatics are concerned. Eurasian milfoil poses a similar threat to curly pondweed and the matting and stuff that it does. The issue with Eurasian milfoil, water milfoil, is that we have a native lookalike, which occasionally will happen. You'll have something that looks almost identical to it.
Okay.
So for this one, you'll have to count the leaflets, the little thin pieces that, you know, they have matching kind of partners on the other side of what you would call a stem.
Sure.
But I won't get into the, you know, the makeup of leaves too in depth. But at any rate, you can see the little, almost like feathers on it. And these will have 13 to 14 or more on the Eurasian water milfoil, the non-native version. The native version goes up to 12 of those little leaflets. So when they did come across this, they had to pull it out and they had to count the leaflets to be sure so that we're taking accurate notes.
That's pretty meticulous.
Yeah, it is. And it sits in the water one way and you pull it out and it kind of goes limp and all comes together and you have to fiddle with it for a little while until you can get them counted accurately. But they did a great job in being diligent with their work, Flowering rush is one that is we're looking out for. We don't see it in this area. It is in the state, but it's one on our list of things to keep an eye out for. And we did not find anything that we could verify as flowering rush, but flowering rush has distinctive triangular leaves in that if you look at them from the top down, it looks like an extra long or tall pyramid. It's a three-sided leaf, which is pretty distinct. And we saw some of those, but none of those have grown stems or sprouted any flowers. And I've been going back and checking those every couple of weeks or so to see if there's any change. And we've sent them out for testing to see. And we haven't heard back anything verifiable yet. I feel pretty comfortable saying it's probably not flowering rush. But there's a potential that it is, and we want to keep an eye on it. So as soon as we hear back on that, we'll respond accordingly. But as of now, technically, there is no flowering rush reported. But we're remaining diligent and aware.
Well, that's great. That kind of goes back to our conversation from last time about the early detection and rapid response. Just keeping an eye on something, because if you thought, oh, it's fine, and you don't go back and check it, and it is something bad, and you haven't gone back and done the due diligence that you are saying that you guys have done, which is amazing, then it's able to quickly overtake anything, and who knows how far it could go before you catch it again.
Absolutely, and the cost of treatment goes up, and the likelihood of total eradication goes down. So it's a lot easier to remove a small handful of plants than to clear an entire field or river of a plant. So we're really keeping an eye on it to make sure that we can get on it as quickly as we can.
That's great, and that's promising that it sounds like it's not flowering rush.
Yeah, it's a pretty distinct plant, so it's odd that there's as much discussion on figuring out what it is, but plants, like just like people, they're same species, but they can take on different shapes and sizes and things, and there's a number of variables. So we're looking into all of them so that we're sure. So we actually ended up dividing it into two separate stretches, the survey. There was a southern portion, which was the majority of it, but because we struggled to find access to the northern stretch, it took us a while to get up there. So a lot of the data was recorded late spring, and then by the time we got up to the northern portion where we saw a lot of that purple loosestrife, that was late summer by that point. So technically some of the data, we published it, it's on our website for those that want to look at it a bit more in detail. It is divided up because of that, just for the sake of sound science and consistency. It's divided up in two different ways. So
there's really two different sections of the river that you can look at and say, this is what we surveyed here and this is what we surveyed there. Yeah,
and we even kind of went backwards. I mean, again, we did kind of the southern portion of it first, and then we went back up and did the northern portion once we finally found some private landowners that would let us use their backyards as an access point, which we're very grateful for.
Absolutely.
So, and again, if there are those interested in more of the details on what all was found exactly where and along the river, that's in our presentation that we have published on our website. And we can see a bit of a breakdown there for folks that want more information concerning that. So we did have some things that were categorized as other,
Okay.
which again, we can break it down further from there, but just things that weren't expected to the point that they were added to the list of things that they could select from when reporting the species. And so that composed a relatively small portion of the things that they found, but there were a few other things on that list.
Sure.
So the next steps with the survey is we're going to get in touch with landowners that we found to have invasives directly on their property.
Sure.
So we're going to send out mailers here in the near future, and folks can expect to see those, and it just will essentially say, hey, we did a survey in the river and found this on your property. This is what you can, this is what it is. This is what you can do to treat it if you like, and here's our information if you have any questions. Just to continue that spread of education and awareness.
Absolutely.
So that'll be the next steps, and then following that, we're going to take a look at treatment options that we might have for getting everything taken care of, and hopefully getting some of those plants out of the river, or at least mitigating them a little bit more.
Sure.
So we have to take a deeper look at that data and decide how we want to approach that and what our areas of greatest concerns are going to be.
Absolutely. And I'm sure treatment efforts are even more specific in an aquatic system, where you have to be even more delicate and careful with something like herbicides. Or other control methods that maybe would be safer for the environment than herbicides, and if herbicides aren't absolutely necessary.
Yeah, definitely. That's you have to approach aquatic treatment very cautiously, because even if you're spraying an herbicide on land, I know plenty of people shy away from herbicides for a number of reasons, but you spray that in a terrestrial setting and the wind can pick it up and take it down a little bit, but eventually gravity will bring it back down, and
Sure.
you know, that'll be the end of it. Wherever it hits, it has an area of impact. But you put that in the water, especially a moving body of water like
Absolutely.
a river. If you're treating up at one point, it's going to go down
Right.
the river like everything else in a river does. So it's a different ball game, and it has its own set of complexities in terms of treatment and how to approach it. So we have to be very careful on how we do that, and that'll be our plan moving forward. We're going to approach this cautiously and with
Sure.
all the safety that we can, but you know, for some of these, you do have to get out the herbicides and treat them that way, and there are specific ones for treating aquatics. So they've gotten it down to a pretty decent science. So.
Sure. Or even those biocontrol alternatives that you were discussing earlier with the beetle and the purple loosestrife. I think that's a really cool alternative that's environmentally friendly and gets the job done.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to talk to the state a bit and see about the permissions for using those beetles, but I'm hopeful that they'll give us the go-ahead eventually to treat that, especially because the purple loosestrife, as I said, is intermingled with native plants that have cropped up.
Sure.
So you can't just do a big blanket spraying of the area, because now you're taking out these native plants. So the beetles will target those better than we could with an herbicide or something, and
Sure.
help us get those numbers down. So we're hopeful for the treatment and everything moving forward with this survey. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do and what changes to expect moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, I think it was a great idea. I think something like a failure of a dam as large and catastrophic as what we had here in Midland, people look at the economic ramifications, but I think the ecological ramifications can often be overlooked. So the SISMA's perspective on what was possibly spread through the flood, and how was it spread and how much of it was spread, I think those are good questions to be asking, and it sounds like the survey succeeded in answering a lot of those questions, and it's cool to see what you guys plan to do moving forward with this project. You'll definitely have to keep us updated on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I'll be sure to let you know what we've got going on moving forward. So thank you very much for letting me talk about this for a while.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Matthew. We appreciate your time. If you want to learn more about the SISMA, we did have a previous episode where we took a little bit of a deeper dive into what SISMAs do, what SISMAs are. As a reminder, that's a cooperative invasive species management area. That episode also features a little bit more on invasive species here in Midland and watch list species for the state of Michigan. So we thank you for watching. We appreciate your viewership and your support. And until next time, conservation matters.